In this lesson, we're going to use a fake backend service called JSON placeholder. You can find it at jsonplaceholder.typecode.com. On this website, we have various endpoints for getting a bunch of posts, comments, albums, photos, to-dos, and users. So in this lesson, we're going to use the to-dos endpoint for getting a bunch of to-dos or reminders. Now, back to our project. In this component, we are not going to write any code for calling an API because this component should only be responsible for rendering the UI, nothing else. Other concerns like calling an API or storing something in the local storage should be implemented in other classes, okay? So back to our project. In the source folder, we're going to add a new folder called services. And here we're going to add a new file called reminder.ts. Now to call the backend, we're going to use Axios. This is not necessary, but it's a library that I personally use often. So back to the terminal, let's install Axios. Good. Now on the top, we import Axios from Axios. Now Axios comes with type definition files, so we don't need to install them separately, okay? Now here we're going to define a class called reminder service. In this class, first we're going to define a property called HTTP. We could call it anything, but HTTP makes sense. We're going to set it to axios.create. Now here we pass a configuration object. Look, because we have TypeScript support in Axios, we can see the type of this parameter, which is Axios request config. So if we press Control and space here, we can see all the properties and their type. So here I'm going to set base URL to, now back to the browser. Let's grab this URL and paste it right here. So that is our base URL. And now we're going to define a bunch of operations or methods for getting to-dos, adding them, and removing them. So let's define a method called getReminders. Here we call this.http.get. Now this get method is generic. So here we can type angle brackets and specify the type of objects we expect to get. We're going to get a reminder array. Okay. Now here we specify the URL or the endpoint, which is /todos. Now this returns a promise, so we need to await it to get the response. And we need to make this method async. And finally, we return response.data. Nothing fancy, you're probably familiar with this approach. Now we need another method for adding a to-do. So add reminder, takes a title of type string. Here we call this.http.post. We're going to post a reminder object. Now for the URL, again, we're going to pass /todos. And for the data, we're going to pass an object with the title property. Once again, we await the call to get the response. And finally, we return response.data. And we make this async. And one last method. That is remove reminder, which takes an ID of type number. And here we call this.http.delete. We don't need to supply a generic argument here. We just pass a URL like /todos plus ID. As simple as that. Now let's await the call to get the response, and here we return response.data and make this async. Okay, so our service is ready. The final step is to export it. So export default. Now instead of exporting the reminder service class, we're going to export an instance of this class. With this, the consumers of this module don't have to new up an instance of this service every time. Okay, that's just a little bit easier. So we're done with this step. Next, I'm going to show you how to use the effect hook to get the list of reminders when our application starts.